My family banned me from Christmas because of my job, but they never knew I paid her bills. The room was small, filled with the soft beeping of monitors and the faint scent of peppermint lotion Claire always used for her patients. Claire adjusted the blanket over Mrs. Ellery's shoulders, tucking it in gently. The older woman's skin was thin and spotted, but her eyes were clear and watching Claire with a familiar warmth. "Still haven't taken a break, have you?" Mrs. Ellery asked, her voice raspy but amused. Claire smiled as she handed over a small bowl of soup. "You know me. I rest when you rest." Mrs. Ellery took a spoonful, nodded approvingly, and then glanced at the tiny pine cone ornament someone had taped to the IV pole. "Going home to decorate the tree tonight?" she asked. "Big family party coming up." Claire's smile widened. "Yes, I'm heading home right after my shift. I've got the gifts all wrapped and the scarf Aunt Mona loves. Can't wait to see the tree lit up at Mom's." The older woman grinned. "Good. You deserve to be celebrated too, honey." Claire squeezed her hand. "Merry Christmas, Mrs. Ellery. Merry Christmas, sweetheart." The snow was falling heavier now as Claire stepped out of the hospice centre, her breath puffing out in white clouds. Her scrubs were layered under a thick coat, her feet in waterproof boots. Each flake melted on her eyelashes as she walked toward the bus stop. She clutched her scarf tighter and thought about the cinnamon candles her mum always lit on Christmas Eve. It was almost there, just 3 days left. She imagined it, the familiar sense of home, the chatter in the kitchen, the warmth of a fire crackling in the background. Even if she was the one refilling drinks and doing dishes, she didn't mind. Being surrounded by family was a gift. Her apartment welcomed her with quiet. She kicked off her boots, hung her coat, and went straight to her desk. The lamp's yellow light buzzed faintly. Claire pulled out her laptop and began paying bills like clockwork. $2,000, property tax support for Mom and Dad, $800 Ethan's rent, $135 car insurance renewal for Dad. She didn't blink, just clicked entered codes and confirmed. This was the part of Christmas no one else saw. She reached over for her tea cold now and stood up to stretch. Her gaze moved to the small artificial tree in the corner. No lights on yet. But soon, she thought. Maybe tonight. Then the phone rang. Claire picked it up with a practiced smile. "Hey, Ethan." There was a pause, then a breath. His voice was too calm. "Hey, Claire, just wanted to give you a heads up. Sophie's coming to Christmas this year." Claire blinked. "Okay, that's great. Yeah, she's really big on emotional alignment right now. Healing, energy, and all that." Claire sat down slowly. Ethan continued. "And you know, the stuff you carry from the clinic, it's kind of a lot for her. She's sensitive to energy and, well, we were thinking maybe this year you could just take a break." Claire stared at her laptop screen, the cursor blinking. "A break," she repeated. "Yeah, nothing personal, just trying to keep things calm." Before she could answer, her screen lit up with another call. "Mum," she answered. "Hi, Mum." Her mother's voice was soft, too sweet. "Sweetheart, we just want peace this year. Sophie is very sensitive. If you come, it might make things awkward. Honestly, if you show up, we may not open the door." Claire didn't reply. She looked at the unopened Christmas card she'd written sitting near the edge of her desk. "Wishing you warmth and joy." The ink was still wet. Her mother continued, "It's just for this year." Claire looked over at the little tree. Still dark. Her suitcase, already half-packed, waited silently by the front door. The gifts she'd bought sat neatly stacked, each one carefully chosen. She hung up, and in that silence something settled, not like snow, but like stone. She stood in the centre of her living room, the hum of the heater, the quiet tap of snow against the window. Her breath was shallow, steady. The warmest room she'd been in today was not this one, not this year. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just stood there, hands loose at her sides, looking at the place she had called home. And suddenly, it felt like she'd never really arrived. The tree remained dark. Claire sat cross-legged on the floor beside it, her back against the arm of the couch hands resting in her lap. She didn't bother reaching for the plug. The little plastic branches stood stiff and unlit decorations, catching only the ambient glow from a nearby lamp. The gifts she had wrapped sat patiently beneath it, each one tailored, chosen with care books for Dad, a cozy knit for Mum, a vintage poster for Ethan, a candle Sophie might have liked. Her gaze hovered on the tags. All of them had her handwriting. None of them would be delivered. She leaned forward, picked up one of the gifts, held it for a moment, then set it back down slowly. Then she stood, walked to her desk and opened her banking app. The soft click of keys and the hum of the old laptop were the only sounds in the room. To the $1,000, property tax support. Paused. $800, Ethan's rent cancelled. $135, car insurance for Dad terminated. One after another, line after line. She moved methodically, not rushing, not shaking. It was like brushing her teeth. Routine. I was never celebrated, just tolerated until I wasn't. She paused at that thought, letting it settle. How many birthdays had she paid for cake but wasn't included in the group photo? How many crises had she cleaned up while being labelled too intense? How many dinners had she quietly exited to let others shine? Her eyes drifted to the Christmas card still sitting on the desk, the one she had meant to send with the gifts. She picked it up and opened the envelope. The words inside stared back at her. Wishing you warmth, love, and a little bit of magic. She closed the card, turned it over, and without a flinch tore it in half. Then again, and again, until it was confetti. Not for celebration, but for finality. She was 15, Christmas Eve. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon and browned butter. Claire had spent the entire afternoon baking banana bread with caramel drizzle, her best batch yet. She arranged everything on a platter and even added holly leaves as decoration. She remembered feeling proud. For once she thought they'd notice. They'd say, "Thank you." She set the platter on the long kitchen counter and went to change. By the time she returned, the family was laughing, taking photos of the food. Her mother waved her over, pointing at the label next to the bread. "Ethan's banana bread, baked with love." Claire froze. "Ethan?" she asked. "He didn't—" Her mum waved her off. "It's just a fun label, sweetheart. Let him have his moment." Claire smiled, nodded, and stepped back. In the photo that made the family album, she's barely visible in the corner, holding a plate, not the bread. She never baked banana bread again. She spent the rest of that evening clearing dishes, while everyone praised Ethan's artistic spirit. The platter she had arranged was empty, but no one asked who made it. She remembered dropping the last fork into the sink and whispering to herself, "Don't expect, just give." Back in the present, she sat back down beside the tree. No music, no lights, no heat from a kitchen oven. Just her, the darkened tree, and the faintest hum of something closing inside her. Not hate, not even sadness. Just done. She pulled the scarf Aunt Mona loved into her lap and held it, not to give, not anymore, but to remember she tried. She looked at the tree again, still dark, still hers. She whispered aloud to no one. No more pretending. Then stood up and began removing the name tags from the presents. One by one she peeled them off, folded them and placed them in a drawer. The gifts remained beautifully wrapped, untouched but anonymous now. Like her. The heater clicked on. A draft passed under the window. Claire moved slowly through the apartment, turning off one light at a time, letting the stillness expand. And as the final lamp dimmed, she sat once more beneath the tree, this time with nothing in her hands. Only her own breath, and it was enough. Claire sat cross-legged on her bed, the little notebook open before her like a confession booth. It was one of those sturdy, spiral-bound types with a navy cover and faint grid lines on every page. The kind she used during residency to jot down med notes, patient codes, and dosages. Precise. Efficient. Tonight, it was something else. She wrote at the top in clean capital letters, "What I paid for." Then she began listing. Ethan's emergency flight home, $600. Roof repair after the blizzard, $1 $9.40. Mum's maxed out credit card, $3 $200. Dad's overdue property taxes, $6,000. Ethan's rent, 7 months, $5 $600. Sophie's birthday gift that Ethan forgot, $120. Groceries during COVID, $2 $100. Therapist co-pays for Mum never attended, $450. Ethan's car battery replacement, $160. Plane ticket for Thanksgiving, $390. She paused, tapping the pen against her knee. Her handwriting was calm and tidy. Her pulse was not. It wasn't about the money. Not really. It was about what each line represented: a favour wrapped in silence, a sacrifice unmentioned, a gesture she thought might finally get her seen. She turned the page. Non-monetary contributions. Filed Dad's taxes every April. Translated medical documents for Mum's hip surgery. Co-signed Ethan's apartment lease. He never thanked her. Wisely stayed on the phone with Ethan during his first breakup, missing her shift. Paid for the vet visit when the family dog got sick, even though the dog hated her. Claire leaned back against the headboard, letting the notebook rest on her knees. She stared at the ceiling, its off-white paint catching shadows. I thought love was earned. Turns out it was just taken. The words echoed in her chest like footsteps in an empty hallway. She thought of all the nights she'd chosen to stay late at the clinic, instead of attending dinners where she'd be treated as furniture. She thought of the birthday party she helped pay for, but wasn't invited to. The whispered thank yous that never came. She thought of the years she told herself, "Next time, they'll see. Next time, I'll matter." She thought of the therapy pamphlet she once left on the counter for Mom. She thought of the photo from Ethan's graduation where Claire was cropped out entirely. She turned the page again, then added a final column. Emotional costs. Crying in the parking lot before every Christmas dinner. So, missing out on vacation because someone else needed help moving. Never having a birthday party of her own. The loneliness of being the strong one. That sinking feeling every time someone said, "You're just more responsible." Each entry chipped away a layer of numbness she hadn't realised had hardened. Claire closed the notebook, walked to her desk, opened her banking portal, scrolled to the shared family fund, an account she'd set up 3 years ago when Dad's hours were cut and Ethan was between gigs, the one where she automatically deposited a buffer every month, just in case, quietly. No one asked. She just did it. She clicked into settings. Freeze account. A prompt blinked on the screen. Are you sure? Claire clicked. Yes. Remove joint access. Yes. Cancel auto transfers. Yes. Her hands moved steadily, but her chest ached like a pulled muscle, not a wound. Not anger, not revenge. Clarity. She shut the laptop and stood in the middle of the room, the silence stretching like clean linen. It was as though she had just removed a weight she never realised she was carrying. Her shoulders rolled back. She felt taller. At the window, snow was falling again, blanketing the street below in hush, the kind of snow that muffled the world, that rewrote everything in white. She turned off the lamp and let her room fall into dusk. In the quiet, she could almost hear her own breath again. The ledger was closed. For good. Claire was digging through the hallway closet, looking for an extra roll of tape when her fingers brushed against the worn corner of a familiar navy blue sketchbook. The cover was scuffed, one spiral slightly bent, its pages swollen from time and Denver's humidity. She froze. Her breath caught before she even flipped it open. She remembered this book, the one she used during med school. Not for notes, not for charts, but for moments. In stolen minutes between shifts, she would sketch her world, the outline of a patient's hand resting in stillness, the arch of an old man's back as he laughed, even the shape of a snow-laced branch outside the hospice window. They were quick drawings. Raw, honest, alive. She opened the first page. Pencil smudges. A hospital hallway in perspective. Page 2, an IV stand with a pine cone dangling from its hook. Page 3, a pair of slippers, worn fuzzy ones, by the foot of a hospice bed. Memories poured out in graphite. And then she remembered. The last time she'd seen the sketchbook, it was sitting on the kitchen counter at her parents' house. She had left it open to a drawing of Mrs. Ellery's hand creased tender elegant. She had meant to show it to her mum, hoping to share something real. Instead, 2 days later, she found it tossed in the recycling bin under an empty egg carton and a crumpled receipt. She asked about it. Mum had said, "Oh, that old thing, I thought it was scrap paper." Besides, what were you even drawing? It looked weird. Claire sat down on the floor of the hallway sketchbook in her lap. It hadn't been weird. It had been her. Her truth caught between pages. She flipped deeper. There was a sketch of a patient named Roy, his oxygen mask slightly tilted, one eye open, watching the window. Another showed the hands of 2 hospice volunteers passing out cookies drawn with tenderness. She remembered the exact sound the cookie tin made, the way Roy chuckled when she offered him one with too many sprinkles. These weren't just drawings. They were echoes of connection, proof she had made people feel seen, even if her family never had. Her hand trembled as she turned to a blank page in the back, the last one not yet filled. She picked up a pen from the desk nearby and began to write not a sketch this time, but a letter. Dear Claire, age 10. You are not too much. You are not too quiet, too emotional, too intense. You are not too serious for their jokes or too sensitive for their comfort. You are just too real for them, too brave to look away from pain, too honest to play pretend, too vibrant for a world that fears what it cannot control. They won't celebrate you because they don't understand you. But that doesn't make you wrong. That makes you rare. Keep drawing, keep caring, even if they roll their eyes, even if they forget your birthday, even if they throw away your sketchbook. You matter. You're not scaffolding. You're a whole cathedral. With love, Claire, age 35. When she finished, Claire let the pen rest against the page. Her eyes burned, but she didn't cry. Not anymore. She slipped the letter back into the sketchbook and placed it gently on her bookshelf, where it would stay visible. This time, no one would throw it away. She stood up, brushed her hands on her jeans, and looked around her apartment. It was quiet, still scented with the cinnamon candle she lit days ago. Claire had spent years trimming parts of herself to fit into their version of daughter, sister, and woman. But no more. She wasn't shrinking for them. She took the sketchbook back out, sat by her window, and opened the page with Roy. She added a few more strokes and darkened the lines round his smile, then turned to a fresh page and began sketching her own reflection, in the window, blurred soft but unmistakably present. And now she had the proof in ink and graphite that she had always been more than enough. Even when they couldn't see it. Outside, the snow kept falling, and for the first time, Claire let it cover every step she had ever taken trying to prove her worth. She belonged to herself, and that would finally be enough. Claire was brewing tea when the phone rang again. It was Sunday evening, and snow still whispered against the windows. She glanced at the caller ID Aunt Ramona. She hesitated, then picked up. "Claire, honey," came Ramona's voice, unusually soft. "They say you ruined Christmas." Claire blinked. "I wasn't even there." "I know," Ramona said. That's what makes it all the more ridiculous. Claire leaned on the counter mug, forgotten. What happened? Ramona sighed and then began. It was after dinner. Sophie was admiring the family photos on the mantel. You know the old one, your birthday party when you were maybe 11? Claire remembered it. The picture was blurry, her smile crooked, one sleeve too long. A sweater she had saved up to buy herself. She hadn't known it was still on display. She stopped in front of that photo, Ramona continued, and said, "That's Dr. Claire Morgan, isn't it?" Everyone went quiet. Claire's heart skipped. She recognized me, yes, Ramona said. She told the room that you were the doctor who stayed with her grandmother through her final night, that you held her hand when no one else would. She said you saved her, not just medically, but emotionally. Claire sat down slowly. Ramona's voice lowered, and then she asked them, "This is the sister you said was always difficult." There was a long pause on the line. Claire whispered, "What did they say? I don't know. I think they tried to brush it off, but Sophie wasn't buying it. She packed up and left before dessert. Told them she didn't like how truth gets rewritten in this family." Claire closed her eyes. That night, Ramona added Sophie posted something. Not by name, but clear enough. A few lines about people being erased to make others more comfortable, about how silence is a form of violence, about rewriting real people into roles that fit prettier stories. Claire sat in silence. Ramona went on. The post spread. You know how her circles work, art communities, medical circles. People are talking not about you, about them. Claire didn't say a word. She only exhaled slowly, as if releasing years of being misunderstood. She saw you, Ramona said quietly. And now others do too. Claire didn't answer. Ramona didn't push, just wanted you to know. That your absence, it was louder than any words you could have spoken. Claire looked out the window at the street covered in snow. Her reflection stared back, still calm, but more solid than it had ever been. She didn't need to post a response. She didn't need to clarify or defend herself. Truth had a way of surfacing even without her voice. She hung up the phone and took her tea to the window. Lights blinked from apartments across the street. Somewhere a radio played faint holiday music. For the first time, Claire didn't feel like she was missing out. She was exactly where she needed to be. And sometimes the party you skip is the one that finally reveals your worth. Later that night, Claire opened her laptop not to work or write, but to search for the post Sophie had made. It didn't take long to find it. Her words were plain, the image stark, an empty chair at a family table. The caption read, "Some families celebrate unity, while silently omitting the ones who made their peace possible." This year, I saw what was missing. And it broke the story wide open. Thousands of likes, comments from strangers. People share their own versions of Claire's story. My sister was the glue too. I was written out because I stopped being convenient. Your absence can be the loudest thing you ever say. Claire didn't like or comment, but she saved the post because someone had told the truth. And for once, Claire didn't have to be the one to shout it. She sipped her tea, wrapped herself in the blanket by the window, and stared at the twinkling lights beyond the glass. There was pain, yes, but also something new, something close to freedom. The kind of freedom that comes not when you leave the party, but when the party no longer defines your worth. The snow had quieted, but the silence in Claire's apartment remained a sacred chosen silence. Her days returned to the rhythms she knew best, the early shift at the hospice centre, the scent of antiseptic and peppermint lotion, and the soft shuffle of slippers in the hallway. And yet, something was different now. She walked those halls lighter. It was a Friday afternoon when the letter arrived. Tucked among flyers and utility bills, the envelope stood out thick, cream-coloured, hand-addressed, in delicate cursive Claire Morgan. She paused, fingers resting on the edge. The return address was the hospice centre. Back inside, Claire sat at her kitchen table, lit by a pale winter sun. She opened the envelope carefully, heart steady but curious. The letter inside was simple and heartfelt. It read, "Dear Claire, thank you for never looking away, for sitting beside me in silence when words were too heavy, for holding my hand without fear, for bringing warmth into rooms most people avoid. You were the only one who didn't flinch from death. You reminded me that I mattered, that I wasn't just a diagnosis or a timeline, that I was still someone worth kindness. With love, Mrs. Evelyn Ellery." Claire's breath caught. She reread it then again. The handwriting trembled in places, the ink slightly smudged, but the care, the intention was unmistakable. She didn't cry. Instead, she stood and walked to her desk. From the bottom drawer, she pulled out a wooden frame she'd meant to use for a graduation photo years ago. Instead, she gently placed the letter inside. She hung it above her desk where the light from the window could touch it every morning. She stepped back and looked at it, feeling the weight of something shift inside her. Recognition not from the people she'd spent her life trying to please, but from someone who had seen her fully. No expectations, no edits, no conditions, just gratitude, honest and earned. Her mind wandered back to the countless times she'd stayed late, skipped meals, held trembling hands that would soon be still. She'd done it all without fanfare, because it mattered. And now someone else had said it out loud. She sat down, letting the quiet settle. Her gaze drifted to the letter, and a thought formed warm and steady. I wasn't invisible. I was unseen by the wrong people. In the distance, church bells rang. She closed her eyes and listened not to the world outside, but to the space within her that had once begged to be noticed. Now it simply breathed. She didn't need the spotlight. She had something better, proof that who she was mattered. To the right person, it always had. That evening, Claire pulled out a second notebook, the one she'd started after Christmas. She turned to a blank page and began writing not a journal entry, but a letter of her own. "Dear Evelyn, your words found me on a day when I didn't know I needed to be found. You gave me something my family never managed to affirmation, not for what I could do for them, but for simply being. You reminded me why I chose this work, not to be praised, but to connect, to witness, to hold space for others the way no one ever held it for me. Thank you for seeing me, for naming the thing I thought would always go unnamed. I will never forget you." She signed it, folded it neatly, and placed it in the drawer next to Evelyn's letter. A sacred space now. Later, she called the hospice centre and asked to speak to Evelyn's daughter. When the woman answered, Claire introduced herself and said simply, "Your mother gave me a gift I'll never forget." There was a pause, and then the woman said, "She always said you were her light." That night, Claire lit a candle not out of ritual, but reverence. She sat by the window, framed by snowfall, the glow of the letter on her wall, and the silence that no longer felt lonely. This was the gratitude that counted, not grand gestures, but being seen and being remembered. Claire sat at her kitchen table, the light of her laptop casting a soft glow on the wood. Snow tapped gently on the window pane, muffling the silence. Her inbox pinged. One new message. Subject, "Let's start fresh." She clicked, already numb to what might lie within. The email was signed jointly, Mom, Dad, Ethan. That, in itself, was odd. They never wrote emails together. It read like a press release. "We understand emotions were high. The holidays can be stressful. We all value family deeply. Let's reset things and focus on what matters." Claire scrolled slowly. The phrases were hollow, each line carefully worded to avoid an actual apology. Then, halfway through the email, the real purpose emerged. If you could reach out to Sophie and clarify, that might really help. The post she made, well, it's impacting Ethan's image. He's been getting fewer responses on job applications. Some gallery contacts pulled back. It's a bit of a mess. Claire exhaled through her nose, the sound almost a laugh. Of course. This wasn't about healing. This wasn't about her. It never was. She didn't respond. She simply closed her laptop, stood up, and went to refill her mug of tea. As the kettle hissed to life, her thoughts returned to a phrase echoing quietly in her chest. Not because they missed me. Because I cost them now. She thought back to years past countless emergencies when she had dropped everything to show up. The time Julia No Ethan had called her in tears over a car accident he caused while texting. She had wired the money without judgment, paid the deductible, paid the ticket, paid for the tow. No, thank you. Just the expectation of her continued support. And now that her absence created inconvenience, rather than her presence offering relief, she was suddenly necessary again. This wasn't love. This was leverage. She was a pillar removed from their house of cards. The tea steeped dark in her favourite mug, a chipped ceramic one that read, "You are enough," a gift from a patient 3 Christmases ago. She looked at it for a long moment, then turned it to face her directly. Later that evening, as the sky bruised purple with nightfall, Claire sat down and opened a fresh page in her notebook. At the top, she wrote, "When absence is noticed, more than presence, it isn't love that's missing, it's utility." She began listing not just the financial acts, the mortgage payments, the surprise surgeries, but the emotional labour. Mediating family feuds. Writing Ethan's grad school essays. Coaching Mom through her insurance paperwork. Filling in when Dad forgot anniversaries. Being the stand-in for celebrations others never showed up to. She paused, the pen trembling in her hand. It wasn't the list that hurt. It was the realization that no one had ever asked how she was managing it all. No one ever offered to carry the weight with her. Only now, when she dropped it, did they notice its heaviness. Her phone buzzed, another message, this time from a cousin she barely spoke to. "Hey, love, I heard you're going through something. Sending light and positive vibes. Let me know if you want to join our family mindfulness retreat." Claire stared at it, then laughed out loud. The absurdity of being labelled the one going through something when all she'd done was stop. Stop giving, stop apologising, stop showing up as scaffolding for others' comfort. She typed no response. Instead, she walked to her bookshelf and retrieved Marina's letter. Still framed, still powerful. Her fingers traced the handwriting. The one voice that had truly seen her work, her heart, her impact. Not for what she could fix, but for who she was. And that Claire realised was enough. She placed the frame beside her tea and opened her notebook again. At the bottom of the page she wrote, "This isn't estrangement, it's emancipation." Then she closed the book, wrapped herself in a blanket, and let the quiet be her peace, not her punishment. Sunday came wrapped in ice, the kind of cold that made the air brittle as if the world might shatter with one misstep. Claire sat by the window in her apartment, a mug of cooling chamomile tea resting in her palms. The steam had already faded, but she still held it, as if warmth could be willed into being by wanting it enough. She had just returned from her shift at the hospice. The silence in her apartment was thick, deliberate, a calm she had come to cherish. There was no holiday playlist, playing no smell of cinnamon candles, no blinking lights on the small tree in the corner. Just peace. Then came the knock. It started softly, as if whoever stood outside knew they didn't belong there. Claire didn't move. The knocking came again, louder this time, followed by muffled voices. She rose, walked to the door, and looked through the peephole. There they were. Her mother, bundled in her beige winter coat, clutched her purse like it held something fragile. Her father, arms crossed, jaw-tense eyes darting from side to side. Ethan stood slightly behind them, shifting from foot to foot like the sidewalk was too cold for him. Claire didn't feel fear. She didn't feel anger. She felt distance. The kind of distance not measured in miles, but in years of being unseen. She unlocked the door and opened it just a crack. Just enough to let in the voice of the cold, not enough to let in old habits. Her mother spoke first, her voice laced with the kind of sweetness that usually preceded manipulation. "Claire, honey, we just want to talk." Claire said nothing. She looked at her mother's face, the lines, the carefully painted lips, the nervous smile. She looked at her father's stoic stance and at Ethan's tired eyes which couldn't meet hers. "We didn't mean to hurt you," her father added, voice stiff, practiced. "Things got complicated." Ethan finally spoke. "We miss you, Claire. Please, let's fix this." Claire's fingers tightened around the edge of the door. The heat from her apartment clashed with the sharp bite of winter air seeping through the crack. She remembered the way her phone had buzzed weeks ago with their rejection, the way her mother had said, "If you come, we may not open the door." And now they stood on the other side of hers, asking to be let in. Their irony wasn't lost on her. She drew a breath not to speak, but to ground herself. To find her voice not in their approval, but in her own clarity. Then, with a voice as steady as stone, she said, "No." Her mother's eyes widened, a flicker of disbelief crossing her face. Her father's brows furrowed. Ethan took a step forward as if he might beg. But Claire didn't wait. She closed the door. Slowly. Quietly. No slam. No dramatic punctuation, just a boundary. She stood there for a moment, her hand still on the doorknob, listening to the muffled voices on the other side. First, pleading, then frustration, then silence. She walked back to her desk and picked up her tea. It was cold, now bitter on her tongue. But it was hers. This silence, this solitude, it wasn't empty. It was full of the self she had reclaimed. For years, she had opened herself wide, offering pieces of her time, her money, her spirit, just to feel included. She had been the scaffolding holding up a family that only called her in emergencies. Now she'd finally stepped out of the frame, and the structure shook. She didn't cry. She didn't collapse. She didn't doubt. She just sat, watching the snow gather outside the window. For the first time in years, the world felt still, not because she was frozen, but because she had stopped chasing. There was a freedom in the words she had spoken. No, not in anger, not in retaliation, but in peace. Her phone buzzed once on the table. She glanced at it. A message from Ethan. "We're still outside. Please don't do this." She didn't respond. Instead, she reached for a pen and her notebook. She turned to a blank page and wrote the date in the corner. Then she wrote, "Today I chose myself." Outside, the voices finally faded. A car engine started. Tires crunched on snow. Claire stayed by the window, sipping her tea. The streetlights glowed against the snow, casting golden halos on the pavement. Inside, the warmth returned, slowly, naturally, like it belonged there. She didn't need to open the door to find peace. She had carried it within her all along. The morning after the storm had passed, the world outside was wrapped in a blanket of pristine snow. The city was quieter than usual, the streets hushed beneath fresh drifts. Inside her small apartment, Claire awoke not with the sting of loneliness, but with a calm that felt new, anchored. Sunlight seeped through the windows, casting golden rays across her living room. Her eyes landed on the corner where the little artificial Christmas tree stood. For days it had been dark, a silent monument to what she had lost. But this morning it looked different, less like a forgotten thing and more like a possibility. She stood padded across the room in thick socks and reached into the small drawer beneath her bookshelf. Inside was a tangle of fairy lights carefully coiled waiting. She hadn't touched them in years without a sense of duty. Now she unravelled them, testing the plug, watching the bulbs blink to life soft and warm. Claire hung each strand with quiet reverence, wrapping the lights around branches, tucking them gently among the ornaments she had once made by hand. There was a little felt heart stitched in uneven red thread, a pine cone sprayed in silver paint, a paper star from a childhood craft project. She kept these, all not because anyone else had valued them, but because they were hers. When the last bulb had been placed, she stepped back. For a moment, she simply looked. Then she flipped the switch. Light danced across the walls. It wasn't grand. It wasn't a fireplace-lit champagne toast family portrait moment. But it was enough. It was hers. Claire walked to her desk and pulled out a single unmarked Christmas card. She chose one with a red cardinal perched on a snowy branch. Inside she wrote in simple cursive, "Dear Claire, you made it. You held the line. You didn't fold. You gave kindness even when it wasn't returned. You stayed true even when no one saw. You walked through fire and built something beautiful from the ashes. I'm proud of you. You are not too much. You are just right. Merry Christmas from someone who finally sees you. Love me." She sealed the card and tucked it into the branches of the tree. Across the desk, the framed letter from Mrs. Ellery caught the sun. The ink had begun to fade slightly, but the words still glowed. "You made me feel alive again." Claire reached over, touched the frame gently and smiled. She poured herself a cup of peppermint tea stronger than usual and sat in the armchair by the window. Outside, children played in the snow, their laughter muffled by scarves and mittened hands. Inside, the only sound was the gentle hum of the heater and the occasional crackle from the tree lights warming up. Claire wasn't alone. Not truly. She had her memories, her truth, and finally her voice. There had been a time when she believed love meant shrinking, paying invisible dues and carrying unseen burdens. But now she understood love wasn't a currency. It was a connection, and it started with self-recognition. A knock hadn't come that morning. No desperate calls, no bargaining, and even if they did come, she knew now that she would answer from a place of strength, not need. She picked up a small photo, an old one of herself at age 7, missing a front tooth and holding a gingerbread cookie larger than her face. She placed it beside the card in the tree. "You made it, kid," she whispered. For the first time in a long while she felt joy, not despite being alone, but because of how whole she had become. The room wasn't big, but it had one light, and that, finally, was enough. The morning sun rose, quietly spilling pale gold across the snow-dusted balcony. Claire stood, with a blanket draped over her shoulders, a warm mug of chai tea in her hands, the scent of cinnamon and cloves curled in the steam drifting upward into the chilled air. She breathed in slowly, watching her breath join the morning fog. The city below was gentle, as if it too had decided to pause. Cars moved like whispers across icy streets, and far-off children's laughter echoed faintly through the winter air. Claire's apartment was still the kind of stillness she used to resist. For years, silence had been the sound of abandonment. But now it was something else. A sanctuary, a reward, a long overdue homecoming to herself. She leaned on the balcony railing and looked at the world with soft eyes. It was Christmas morning, but this time there were no obligations. No frantic kitchen prep, no cold car rides with 2 warm casseroles in her lap. No tiptoeing around volatile moods or pretending her feelings didn't take up space. This year was hers. No one had messaged since the door closed. No last-minute apologies. No guilt-riddled voicemails. Just the silence. She looked through the glass door in her living room. The little tree stood lit in the corner, ornaments glinting in soft golden tones. The card she had written to herself was still nestled under the branches. Nearby, the letter from Mrs. Ellery lay beside her notebook pages, now filled with thoughts and small reflections from the past few weeks. She turned back to the snowy view and let the words come to her. They didn't see me because I trained them not to. The realization landed gently. Not an accusation, not regret, just clarity. She had spent years bending herself to fit into a mould that had never been hers. Smiling through dismissal, softening her grief so others didn't have to see it, paying debts that weren't hers, both emotional and financial. She had thought love meant earning her keep in a family, that it meant being the glue, silent, steady, selfless. But not this year. This year, she unplugged the pattern. This year, she reclaimed the silence and filled it with presence. She learned that peace wasn't something handed to you by others, it was a boundary you built and defended with grace. Claire took another sip of tea, warm now through every inch of her fingers. She thought of her younger self, the girl who used to stand at the edge of the Christmas party, holding a plate of cookies no one would eat, waiting to be seen. And she thought of that same girl now lighting a tree for herself, writing her own name on a Christmas card and choosing rest over performance. Inside, the kettle began to whistle again. She went inside, refilled her cup, and returned to the chair by the window. She wrapped herself tighter in the blanket and opened her journal. On a new page, she wrote, "This year, I unplugged Christmas. Not from joy, not from hope, but from the need to be needed. From the old stories where love was conditional. This year, I stayed home with myself and found I wasn't lonely. I was free." She placed the pen down, folded her legs underneath her, and let the sunlight warm her face. It wasn't a perfect holiday. There were no extravagant gifts or glittering dinners. But it was honest. It was healing. It was hers. The world continued outside cars, honking faintly, wind brushing snow off tree limbs, but inside Claire had everything she needed. For the first time, she didn't just survive the holidays, she lived them. She let her phone rest unanswered and unbothered. She watched the tree lights flicker. She sipped her tea, and she whispered into the quiet, "Merry Christmas, Claire." And for the first time ever, it was enough.